a little reminiscing on my part. About 6 years ago, when the late Judge Ludwig was in the chair, I was in this room, and I think it was about this time of year because the air conditioning system was not working well, and I gave a talk on the guys that came out of that building to go off to Indiantown Gap and ultimately to fight World War II. So I guess I'm stuck on Shule Avenue. It has become a centerpiece in my life as a historian. So what I want to talk about in a number of our events here in the Historical Society over the past several months, incidentally, all of which have been marked by rain. We have talked a lot about G Company and their departure to war, talked about the men who did not come back, and have said other things. I think it's time to pull all this together and talk about the company and their participation in World War I. To get to that, we got to go back and talk about citizen soldiers and the National Guard. Many of us are not real familiar with the National Guard. It's often confused with the Army Reserve. It's the weekend warriors. But the Guard has a historical place that marks it as different from the Army Reserve. First of all, the Guard is enshrined in the Constitution. You talk about the organized militia that's mentioned in the body of the Constitution. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy and the militia when called into federal service. Likewise, the National Guard is a state organization. The founders were very clear that they wanted the militia to be a local organization. And over the years, through the Civil War and the post-Civil War era, Guardsmen became the governor's soldiers as well as backups for the regular army. In that role, they were also a police force. The Guard was called out on numerous occasions to quell labor unrest. In fact, there are places in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania where the Guard is not real popular even today because of its role in suppressing labor problems. Anyway, we didn't have a state police force until 1905. And so that was the only thing the governor had to turn to. In the last quarter of the 19th century, the Guard started to evolve into the shape it was in around 1900. That is, an organized state force divided into regiments and companies with fixed, at least theoretically, organizations available both to the governor and to federal service. In 1877, the Doylestown Company, about 60 men, was incorporated as the Nagley Rifles, or G Company of the 16th Pennsylvania Infantry. The 16th kind of lost its identity in a couple of years, and by 1878, it had become G Company of the 6th Regiment Pennsylvania Infantry, which it would remain until 1917. Now, this was a very different military organization than what those of us who've worn the uniform at one time or another conceive of. The officers were elected. In 1916, the commander of the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment decided that, he would take a job that was Brigadier General's position in the state headquarters. And so all of the captains and lieutenants in the 4th Regiment came together down in Columbia, and they spent a Saturday electing a new colonel for the regiment. Turned out he was a pretty good guy, and as it winds up, he commands the Doylestown National Guard once they go off to war. But still, it's a system that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to us. Of course, the Guard was also part of the community. The Armory, after it had been built in 1909, was a community center. You would hold dances, banquets. It's probably the largest under-roof heated space in Doylestown right at the turn of the century, 1909 through 1917. And the leaders of the Guard are leaders of the community. Take one example. Abel McReynolds was the company commander of the Doylestown Guard unit when the armory was built. Now, he was a businessman, 47 years old in 1917. Here's one of the problems with the Guard. Soldiering is a young man's game. And Abel McReynolds was right floating on the edge of being too old to serve. But he went off and served in the First World War as a major, commanded a battalion of the 112th Infantry. We'll talk about those regiments in a second. And wound up serving honorably, was wounded early on as part of the training that officers went through. They would go to a French unit and actually participate in trench operations. Well, McReynolds had the bad luck not only to get hit, but he also got gassed. So he was taken out of the line and given a job in the services of supply. One of the things, history is so fascinating, it takes you down rat holes. And one of the rat holes that I went down with McReynolds is he came back to the States in 1919, having spent about a year and a half in this services supply job somewhere in France. He no sooner got back to Doylestown than he turned around, filed for a passport, and went back to France, where he remained until 1928, and then returned to Doylestown with a wife. So Abel was able, I guess we could say. Prior to the declaration of war, we were in a bit of a scuffle with Mexico. And Pancho Villa and his people came across the border and raided Brownsville, Texas. There was great hue and cry. Let's send the army to the border. And not only did they send the regular army, but they also sent almost all of the National Guard at one time or another. So here's G Company as they appeared down at El Paso, Texas, serving on the border. They never, legally at least, crossed the border. The National Guard was prohibited from serving on a foreign theater, so they could stay and they could look across, and mostly they did a lot of close order drill and road marches and got dirty and dusty and all covered with the kinds of stuff that you get in the mud and dust of West Texas. They came back to Doylestown, having seen the news in the El Paso paper about the Germans' unrestricted submarine warfare. This, the Lusitania had been sunk in 1915. The Germans had pulled back a little bit from the unrestricted submarine warfare, but in January of 1917, they said, we are going to clamp down, and anybody who sails into this area or into the very limited spaces in the Mediterranean, we're going to sink them on sight. President Wilson was understandably upset. Diplomatic relations were broken off with Germany on February 3rd. All of this is percolating through the population, and G Company comes home. It must have been a chilly day in February when they marched back from the train station. Everybody was glad to see them. They'd learned a good deal about soldiering in those 6 months, and non-commissioned officers and officers had learned a little bit more about their job. They weren't seasoned soldiers, but they were a little bit more than amateurs. Right after they get home, we hear about the Zimmerman telegram. This is the deal where the German Foreign Office had told the Mexican government that, hey, you guys come in. If the United States declares war, we'll give you most of the American Southwest. This was not something that was likely to make the people in Washington feel real good. What really ticked them off more than anything else was the way that this cable got to Mexico. Of course, the British had cut all of the German submarine cables across the Atlantic. There was no way that they could have sent this message by cable, and radio was not that reliable. Couldn't send it by their own means. So what they did, they encrypted the cable, put it in an envelope, walked down whatever street the American embassy was on, walked into the American embassy and said, hey guys, would you send this? And the U.S. Diplomatic Communications Service sent this telegram to Mexico. Luckily, the Brits had broken the code, and as I say, they gave it to the president on February 23rd. It was released to the media February 28th. So the next month was the roll forward to the inevitable declaration of war on April 6th. Woodrow Wilson had not done the country any great favors. In April 1917, the total strength of the active army and the National Guard, something on the order of 200,000. At this time, the Germans were fielding about 7 million men, the Russians about 8, the French about 5 million. There were lots of soldiers fighting in France. And here, Woodrow Wilson says, we are going to fight. With what? Oh, there were no formations in the United States Army larger than a regiment on a full-time basis. Occasionally, they'd put together a brigade or a division for one exercise. What's worse, Wilson's policies and his direction to the War Department had prevented the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy from sending observers to look at what was going on. So not only did the president not have a clue what was going on with the war, but none of his generals really did. This is going to be, unfortunately, the source of a lot of American blood as time goes on. And, logistics always raises its ugly head when you try to do something. We didn't have any place to put any more soldiers than we had. There were no extra army camps. So from May of 1917 until October, November, there was a spate of post-built 32 Army installations, each of them capable of holding something on the order of 30 to 40,000 soldiers, were built in this period. And you can see, if you look closely at this photograph, that barracks building is not painted. It is bare wood. They built the camps, they threw them up, and they got around to painting them at some point. But they were not designed to do much more than keep the troops out of the rain and keep them a little bit warm during the winter time. By May 18th, Congress had passed a draft law. Registration was made. Of course, nobody can move at this point. The National Guard has been put on alert. Some National Guard units were deployed for instance, the ones out in Pittsburgh were deployed posting guards on railroads and steel mills. Not the best use, but everybody was afraid the Germans were going to get involved. Beg your pardon. Excuse me. So anyhow, by September, it's time to start. The National Guard units were prepared for call-up. The draftees were identified. They were told to report on a given date, and they took off. This guy was the fellow who by that time was in charge of Doylestown's unit. George Ross, he's a Princeton graduate, local attorney. He stayed in the law business after the war. He had attended the Plattsburgh training camp, and without burdening it too much, Plattsburgh was an officer training program which businessmen paid to attend. It was part of what was referred to as the preparedness movement, and people would, excuse me, this is a great thing to do if I've got a microphone on. Anyway, Ross paid his way, got a commission. The governor made him a lieutenant. He went to the Mexican border. The governor made him a captain. And in April of 1917, he took command of Company G. At that point, he was 38 years old. Once again, the perils of the Guard is that its officers are getting to be mature, as we would call it today, men. A problem. But off they went. September 12th, 1917, marched down to the station, and off they went to Camp Hancock, Georgia. All of this time, the great military machine is grinding, trying to figure out how are we going to organize these thousands of men who are showing up to these camps. And they decided that they needed big organizations in order to fight the big war. A company had been, in the National Guard's parlance, about 60 or 70 men. They had ballooned up to 150 by the time G Company marched off to war, but the Army said, we need a company of 250 men. Now, I've been a company commander. I commanded a rather large company of about 180. I cannot imagine commanding 250 men as a young captain with somewhere between 2 and 6 months of total military experience. It was tough to do. 4 of these companies in a battalion, 3 battalions in a regiment, 2 regiments in a brigade, 2 brigades in a division. Here's the rub. There's only 4 regiments 4 infantry regiments in this new division. And at that point, there were 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 regiments in the Pennsylvania National Guard. So, consolidation time. Philadelphia's 1st Regiment and the 13th from up around Scranton. I had to use Northeast. Scranton's too long. It wouldn't have fit in a circle. Formed the 109th Infantry. The 3rd Regiment from Philly and the 10th from southwestern Pennsylvania formed the 110th. The 6th, our boys, plus the rest of their regiment from down in Philly, and the 18th from Pittsburgh formed the 111th Infantry, and the 8th from Pittsburgh area and up in northwest Pennsylvania formed the 112th. The poor 4th Infantry was the leftover stepchild. Come on in. And it got broken up. One of its battalions even became a part of another division in the course of the war. Now, this was not a simple, okay, you get half, I'll get half, we'll combine our forces. What basically happened was the commanders and the senior non-commissioned officers of the 18th absorbed the 6th, and officers and senior non-coms tended to go other places. Captain Ross left the company in October and wound up in the 103rd Ammunition Train, which is basically a supply outfit. He finished the war as a major. Others moved on to other places, to the regimental headquarters, and after all this consolidation and a number of medical discharges, 89 of the 150 who had left Doylestown remained in G Company by the time they left for France. Of course, Camp Hancock wasn't simply reorganization. It was training. But you remember, we talked about the level of familiarity with what was going on in the European war on the part of American soldiers. And everybody knew they needed to learn how to do bayonets. Yeah, go out there and stick those Germans. Well, that's good. They have to learn how to march. Oh, did they march? They marched and they marched. They road marched as well. This at least had the benefit of allowing them to toughen themselves up and prepare themselves for what was going to be a very march-intensive campaign in Europe. And of course, they learned to live in the field. But they didn't learn much about machine guns, one of the big technical issues of the First World War. They didn't learn much about grenade launchers. They didn't learn much about barbed wire. None of the things that made the First World War were on the schedule because people didn't really understand what was going on. There were a few French and British officers who came over and did their best, but in the end, the American officers, some of them were even as much as 90-day wonders, some of them with less training, got this unit ready to go. And the following spring, they loaded up on trains, came up to New York City, and Her Majesty's Transport Olympic shipped the entire 3,700 and change soldiers of the 111th Infantry over to Britain. Now, if that silhouette looks familiar, that's because the Olympic was one of the sister ships of the RMS Titanic. Slightly larger, like about a foot longer, but it made a pretty good fast transport because it could outrun submarines. In fact, as they were approaching Southampton to unload the day prior to their arrival, the captain sighted a submarine in front of the Olympic. He didn't run away. He turned the wheel, or ordered his helmsman to turn the wheel, and rammed the Olympic right into the submarine, broke it in two, and it just steamed on to Southampton and let the Navy fellows come by and police up all of the wet Germans. But a bit of excitement for our boys. They landed at Southampton, spent all of one day in Britain, and then took a channel ferry across to France. Initially, they went into a training site just behind the British lines. Now, what had happened in the spring of 1918, as they were moving to the port and going on the ship and coming across the English Channel. The Germans had launched a couple of offensives. They had gotten some really good tactical ideas from their experiences in the Eastern Front, and they were able to really open up and make territorial gains the like of which hadn't been seen since 1914. The plan was to put the 28th Division and the 111th in a training camp with the British, have them work with the British, eventually enter the line with a British unit as a sister unit, and for several weeks learn how to conduct themselves in the trench environment. Well, things have a way of going wrong. The Germans launched another offensive. This one threatened Paris, and the strategic plan went into the trash can. We reworked things. The 111th and the rest of the 28th made a combination of foot march, rail march, road march to a training area just north of Paris, just past where Le Bourget Airport is, in fact, of Lindbergh fame. They had a very short period of training with the French, and then it became time to plug the hole. The Germans, zooming in here, had reached the Marne River at Chateau Thierry. This was like 40 miles from Paris. Scary stuff. The French government was in the process of burning papers, their secret papers, and getting ready to move to someplace else. Well, several of the regular army divisions that were already in France were committed, and the 28th was sent up, principally the 111th, was sent up to engage the enemy around Chateau Thierry and stop them. Now, by this time, the Germans had kind of run out of steam, so the stop was not difficult, but it was a combat experience for the men of the 111th. Gave them a baptism of fire. Now, something's important to realize here. The Germans had made this huge advance. Now, like any other good infantry soldier, when you stop advancing, you start digging. But it takes days to dig a trench system. So this was not full-blown trench warfare. In fact, the 111th and G Company would not see full-blown trench warfare for several more months because they were always either stopping the Germans or chasing them. After the front was stabilized at Chateau Thierry, the French, Americans, and British decided to kick off a series of offensives. The first one was designed to close this bulge in the lines and push the Germans back. The 111th continued to move up this way, and the plan was to stop along the Vesle River right here until the next phase of the offensive. Their corps commander, French general, wasn't really satisfied to stop. It'd be nice to stop there. The river's a good barrier. He said, we want to make a bridgehead across the river. So they chose the little town of Fismes, and its smaller mate, Fismet, on the other side of the vessel, as the place that they wanted to seize a bridgehead. And it fell to the 28th Division to make that bridgehead. Initially, our guys in the 111th attacked west of Fismes into an area that was rife with German machine gun positions, but again, not dug in. The German fortifications were actually built up here, but the The Germans had advanced positions down there in the valley, and it was a bloody and brutal fight. After a short rest, the 111th hooked to the right out of Fismes, crossed the vessel, and headed up into the heights. The Germans were withdrawing, but it was heavy work. You can see in the eyes of this gentleman here, I don't know if he's 111th, certainly he's probably a 28th, or he does not look like this has been an encouraging day for him. In fact, during the Fismet battles, 39 of the Doylestown crew were killed or wounded. I would say probably 12 to 15 of those who were wounded came back. But remember, there's only 89 Doylestown guys to start with in G Company. 44% of them were killed or wounded in that battle. This is for G Company. It is the great bloodletting. This is the great battle of their war. But they were successful in the end. They were taken out of the line, received their first replacements, and prepared very rapidly to participate in the Meuse Argonne offensive. Meuse Argonne is still the largest single battle in American military history. Nothing in the Second World War exceeded the number of Americans involved, the number of Americans killed, and any other measure that you want. This was a big fight. The sector was basically a loop here. It was north of the town of Verdun, which of course is itself quite a famous battle site. And the Germans had had several years to work on defensive positions. Each of these red lines shows a multi-trench defensive position. You think it looks tough? It is. Machine guns, barbed wire, well-protected dugouts where the Germans could survive artillery bombardment. And the 28th, along with 6 other American divisions, was going to take this on. We'll zoom in a little bit. This is the sector that the 28th would ultimately fight in. This is a 2-mile indicator, so we're maybe 2.5 miles wide and about 10 miles, 12 miles deep. Relatively small, but it was a meat grinder. The artillery preparation began at 11 p.m. on September 25th. The infantry jumped off the next morning just about at dawn, and the division was constantly in combat from September 26th until October 8th, actually October 9th, till the last of the units got out of there. 40 days, if I recall the calculation. 14 days, I'm sorry. The division's losses were extremely heavy. This amounted to perhaps 40% of the infantry strength, something on the order of 2,000 men killed and wounded. It was, for the Doylestown guys, not quite as bloody as for others, although they certainly saw enough death and destruction for 2 lifetimes in this fight. They lost their company commander, Arthur Schlosser. Now, George Ross had taken the company down to Camp Hancock. Schlosser had taken over in December, January as company commander of 1918, January 1918. He was a New Yorker, had been a long-time National Guardsman in New York, had gone to one of the officer training programs at Fort Niagara and joined the 28th as a lieutenant and then rapidly was promoted to captain. He commanded G Company from Camp Hancock through the Meuse Argonne offensive and was killed in that attack. After the days in the Meuse Argonne, the 28th was pulled out, reorganized, received more replacements. Our Doylestown guys are becoming more and more of a minority here in the company. They were pulled out and moved from here around to the sector in front of the town of Thiacourt. There, on November 10th, they kicked off an offensive heading north and west into the disputed territories. They stopped at dark on November 10th and got a message at 4:10 the following morning. We will not continue the attack because November 11th. That was it. Those who were still standing, had made it. They had survived. They marked time from November through March. In the Army's inimitable fashion, they drilled a lot. No, you've just completed an intense combat tour. What's the best thing to do? Well, let's do squads right and squads left for a couple of months in the rain or shine. But from November to March, they carried on. They did not participate, as some of the other divisions did, in the occupation of Germany. What many people have forgotten at this remove is that we occupied a considerable radius on the far bank, the west bank of the Rhine, for the better part of the year following the signing of the armistice, until the treaty was signed at Versailles. But 111th didn't get to do that. On March 16th, they began a series of moves to the various ports. They went to Saint-Nazaire, and there boarded a couple of ships to head back to the United States. They arrived on or about the 28th of April of 1919, and the 41 remaining Doylestown boys came home on May 4th. It was quite an affair. Of course, some of their friends were there, guys who had been shipped home earlier, either because of wounds or perhaps because they had the good fortune to be reassigned somewhere else. And that marked the end of the Great Odyssey. Now, we all know, and we have seen the statue down at the corner by the old courthouse that memorializes the men who went. The models, as most of you know, I think, if you've been paying attention to what we've been saying from Historical Society, you know that two of those guys, the two guys who posed for the monument, were G Company men. They were guys who would continue to serve in G Company from 1922, when the National Guard was reconstructed, for several years. Many of the young men who had gone overseas for World War I continued to serve in the National Guard during the 20s, and some of them as late as into the 1930s. I think it's an important story to tell. Okay. Well, I thank you very much. I appreciate your kind attention. And as Fletcher said, thanks for coming out in this awful stuff.